Good morning, everybody. Let's be finding a seat. And just so that I'm not asked 100 times what this obvious big bandage is on my head, I mean, most of you have guessed it right. Beverly was in one of her moods, and yeah, now I'll get another one. I'll have a matching one on this side. No, I had a sebaceous cyst taken off the other day, and I thought it would just be a little Band-Aid they'd put on there, but I got to wear this thing for a week. So anyway, we're in our study of David. And as we left it last week, we've witnessed how Saul is getting increasingly angry, and he's suspicious, and he's paranoid. He's heard people singing David's praises, and he's also seen the way God is blessing David. And his spirit's at civil war within him. He's miserable. He's possessed now by an evil spirit, and he's mentally breaking down. And so as a result, we read this in 1 Samuel 18. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. And again, that word prophesy, the NIV chooses to translate it that way. Some of your Bibles have, what is it, Shirley? He raved. Okay, and in another place is going to translate it as babbled or something along that line. So, anyway, it says here that he was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. And then verse 14 says, in everything he did, this is speaking of David, in everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. And so David's been a model of humility and integrity and dependability. And now all of a sudden everything is just backfiring on him. His crutches are going to be removed from him one at a time over the next section that we're going to be looking at. Well, he was afraid of the threat that he was to him. Yeah, I don't know about physically, but I think he knows that David's the anointed one that's going to replace him. But it must have been especially terrifying to David, especially since he's done nothing. He has done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment. So chapter 19 and verse 8 says, once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. Now, obviously, at this point, David is now an officer in the army of Israel. He may be over a battalion, maybe a division of men. Verse 9 says, but an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. So here's my question. How many of you would give somebody 3 chances to pin you to the wall with a spear? Anybody? Maybe, and I think this shows us the respect that David has for the fact that Saul, at this point, is God's anointed one. And we're going to see this a number of times throughout this story. Some of you remember the story when he's in a cave and Saul comes in to relieve himself in the cave, and David sneaks up, and he could have killed him. And in fact, his guys say, "Why didn't you just kill him?" David says, "I'm not going to put a hand on the anointed one." So there's this level of respect he has, even though this guy's trying to kill him. And I don't get it. One spear throw for me, I'm out of there. Now, these chapters, though, show us how David's crutches are removed one at a time. the first crutch that's removed from him is his good position. David's proven himself to be a faithful, heroic soldier, but he will never again serve in the army of Saul. Second crutch is going to be David's wife. You remember Saul was trying to give an incentive plan to anybody who would kill Goliath. You remember that? And it was that they wouldn't be taxed. Can't remember the other one, but they would also receive Saul's daughter in marriage. You know, what's the third one? Oh yeah, they'd be made rich. Yeah, that's right. And so, verse 17 of chapter 18, in fact, says this. Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage, only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." You see, he's got an ulterior motive here. Let the Philistines do that. But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I'll give her to him," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Saul's motive's not pure. And he's using Michal, his own daughter, as a pawn in this whole thing. Asking David to pay a ridiculous dowry price, if you go on and read the next few verses. The dowry price for Michal is 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, these are not given up voluntarily. You understand that, right? 100 Philistine foreskins. You've got to go fight 100 guys. Well, David not only delivers, but he brings 200. And it just makes Saul more paranoid, more afraid, and more desirous to kill him. So, after David fled from Saul's third spear attempt, he goes home to Micah. Oh, man, I'm not even, forget it. Michal. Verse 11 says, Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. This is going to be a recurring theme in the next few chapters of David's life. Every time we turn around, he's going to be fleeing, he's going to be escaping Saul. In fact, for the next 7 years, David's going to be a homeless outlaw. He's going to be a fugitive. And he wrote a psalm during this time. At least this psalm is attributed to that time. Psalm 59, and here's what it says. For the director of music to the tune, "Do Not Destroy." Does anyone know that song that you could sing that for us? Do Not Destroy. Of David, a miktam. We don't know for sure what that even means. It's some kind of a song notation, but we don't know for sure what a miktam was. When Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. So here's what David wrote. "Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Be my fortress against those who are attacking me. Deliver me from evildoers and save me from those who are after my blood. See how they lie in wait for me? Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, Lord. I've done no wrong, yet they're ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight. But I will sing of your strength in the morning. I will sing of your love. For you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. You are my strength. I sing praise to you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely. And so up to this point in his life, David has been accustomed to killing all of his problems. Lions, tigers, and giants. And no, we're not talking the NFL here. But he kills his opponents. And now he has to run. Verse 13 says, Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, He's ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, Bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. Saul's so desperate, just carry his bed to me and I'll kill him while he's sick in his bed. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, He said to me, Let me get away. Why should I kill you? So Michal lies to her father. David and Michal will be reunited, but their marriage doesn't appear to have been very good. And further, her lie doesn't help David at all. In fact, it only fuels Saul's anger toward him. So David runs through the hills 6 miles away. He flees to Samuel the prophet. Remember, Samuel is the one who anointed David to be the next king. He's a mentor to David. And verse 18 says, When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. So no sooner do they get there, though, than they're ratted out. And so once again, David's on the move. Saul sends men to capture him. And then there's something weird that happens here. And Shirley, I'm going to be interested to hear. I didn't check the New American Standard on this, but I want to know how it translates this thing. So chapter 19 and verse 20 says, But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they prophesied too. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku, and he asked, Where are Samuel and David? Over in Naioth at Ramah, they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah. But the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why people say, Is Saul also among the prophets? So how does it translate, the prophesy thing? So it says prophesy there. Interesting. Eugene Peterson, in his translation, The Message, says that Saul was in a babbling trance. And my gut tells me that's more what's going on here. But we don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to picture Saul being a prophet of God, obviously, in anything he's doing here. But this kind of shows us that God has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Because his Spirit comes on Saul, and it causes Saul to undress right there in public. And that's pretty undignified behavior for a king. Would you agree? In fact, in our day and time, it'd be interesting if this had happened, because how long would it be before there'd be pictures showing up on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram? I mean, this would be public knowledge in moments. But in the process of all of this, David loses his third crutch, which is Samuel, his mentor. And so here he is. He's lost his position in the army. He's lost his position in the king's court. He's lost his wife at this point. and now he's lost his mentor, Samuel. And his emotional stability is slowly eroding. He's running out of options. And so he flees to his friend Jonathan. Now get this. If he flees to his friend Jonathan, where's he fleeing to? Where's Jonathan live? With Saul. So he's fleeing back to the palace to be with his friend Jonathan. So, verse 1 says, Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he's trying to kill me? I want you to notice David begins this conversation by asking Jonathan if David is at fault. He says, What have I done? What crime have I committed? That's interesting. He doesn't accuse Saul. He doesn't attack Saul. And we see such humility in this man here. He assumes that if there's a problem, it must be me. And I'm just not seeing what it is that I've done. And poor Jonathan, he's stuck in the middle, isn't he? Because he, like David, he wants to think the best of his dad. And so verse 2 says, Never, Jonathan replied, you're not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so. Now, you can't blame Jonathan for wanting to think the best of his dad, can you? After all, Saul had given Jonathan an oath back in chapter 19 and verse 6 that he would not harm David. And so Jonathan challenges David's statement. But David's not reassured by this. And so he says in verse 3, it says, David took an oath and said, Your father knows very well that I found favor in your eyes. And he said to himself, Jonathan must not know this or he'll be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only a step between me and death. So he strongly disagrees with Jonathan's assessment of the situation. And he says to Jonathan, don't just brush my words aside. I want you to hear what I'm saying. Do you really think that your dad would be foolish enough to tell you about any plans he has to kill me? And Jonathan seems to be convinced at this point. He still wants to think best of Dad, but he's at least hearing David's side. And so he says, okay, so what's your plan? Jonathan has this ability to trust people and to believe the best about their motives and their intentions. And that ability that made it easy for him to believe his friend's innocence also makes it difficult for him to believe this negative stuff about his dad. And it's encouraging for me to know that in a home where a father was suspicious and paranoid of everyone, a son can grow up who has trust in other people. So David shares his plan with Jonathan, his plan of how to determine what Saul's true intentions are toward him. And so we read this. So David said, look, tomorrow is the new moon feast, and I'm supposed to dine with the king, but let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him, David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan. If he says, very well, then your servant's safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he's determined to harm me. This plan is as much for Jonathan's benefit as it is for David's. David, as a part of Saul's household, would have been expected to be there at that dinner, at that celebration with Saul. And so since Jonathan's going to be present, the plan is, Jonathan, make an excuse for me. Just tell him I wanted to be with my family on this particular event. Shouldn't have any problem with that. It's a reasonable explanation. One that shouldn't have caused Saul any problems. Unless Saul has ulterior motives, right? And then David makes this strange request in verse 8. He says, "As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father?" Isn't that weird? Best friend that I have a covenant with, you kill me if I'm guilty. And Jonathan is appalled at this idea. He says, "Never. If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?" David asked, "Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" Does David suppose for a moment now that his friend would not warn him? Is David getting a little bit paranoid here? A little bit. Can you blame him? Not at all. And so Jonathan takes him out in the field, away from listening ears. Same field where back in chapter 19 and verses 1 to 6, David had been hiding when Jonathan came out there with Saul, and Saul had promised Jonathan on oath that he is not going to harm David. And then Jonathan reassures David with these words. It says, "Then Jonathan said to David, I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time, the day after tomorrow. If he's favorably disposed toward you, will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he's been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. First of all, it's interesting to me. Some of you can remember back in the 80s when Bo Jackson was such a popular athlete, and he never called himself I or me. He never used those pronouns. He always said Bo. And I heard it's because he had a stutter, and it just made it easier for him. He called himself Bo. And Jonathan does the same thing here. You know, you speak of yourself by calling your own name. I mean, I don't know why I even said all that. It's just interesting. Man, what a pickle Jonathan's in. And since this is also the place where Jonathan's going to communicate the outcome of the test, surely in this discussion they're able to point out, Jonathan says, "I'll be right here, you be over there," and they lay out this whole thing. So then we come to verse 18. "Then Jonathan said to David, 'Tomorrow's the new moon feast. You'll be missed because your seat will be empty. The day after tomorrow, toward evening, go to the place where you hid when this trouble began and wait by the stone easel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it as though I were shooting at a target. Then I'll send a boy and say, go find the arrows. If I say to him, look, the arrows are on this side of you, bring them here, then come, because as surely as the Lord lives, you're safe. There is no danger. But if I say to the boy, look, the arrows are beyond you, then you must go because the Lord has sent you away. And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever.'" Now, I want to make this point. We'll get to it much later. But after David is king, he remembers this promise he's made to Jonathan about his family. And so he asks his advisors, is there any descendant of Jonathan that's still left? And there was a young man named Mephibosheth. And it's a beautiful story, and when we get there, we'll talk more about it. But David keeps this vow, this promise that he makes to Jonathan. But this entire event speaks about Jonathan's character, doesn't it? He would have to be older because he had already been in some battles previously. But this would be an ideal time. If Jonathan was really intent on becoming the next king, this would be the ideal time to set David up for a fall, wouldn't it? He wants to remain faithful to his friend, and yet he also wants to be a faithful, submissive son. So, man, he's between a rock and a hard place, isn't he? And so the stage is set. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon feast came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall opposite Jonathan, and Abner, who is his secretary of war, Abner sat next to him. But David's place was empty. Now, Saul says nothing about David's absence that first day. He assumes that for some reason, maybe David was unclean for the feast, and so he assumes something like that's going on. But on the second day, he asks Jonathan where David is, and Jonathan explains to him exactly what they've talked about. David's asked permission to go and spend this time with his family in Bethlehem. He'll be back soon. And that sets off the fireworks. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Don't I know that you've sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother you bore? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will ever be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." "Why should he be put to death?" Jonathan asked. "What's he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Now, we have something to be very grateful for here, and that is that Saul couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with a spear. This is 4 times he's tried. He's missed every time. Jonathan leaves the table angry. So verse 35 says, "In the morning Jonathan went to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, 'Run and find the arrows I shoot.' As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, 'Isn't the arrow beyond you?' Then he shouted, 'Hurry, go quickly, don't stop.' The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. The boy knew nothing about all this, only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, 'Go, carry them back to town.' After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept the most." Okay. I'll be honest with you. I've never gotten this story. I can remember being told this story when I was a kid in Sunday school. And I just don't get it. What is this whole charade they're going through with the arrow thing? Because as soon as they go through that, then they get together out there and talk anyway. Okay, that's a good way to reason it. That makes sense. So they end up getting together, though, and talking. And I know it could have been risky, right, Phil, if anyone's watching. So, but this is a touching scene, isn't it? David's grief is deep. He's grieving the loss of a good friend. And Jonathan can't forsake his father, and you can understand that too. Jonathan's going to end up dying because he stays as loyal as he can to this father who's tried to run a spear through him. So verse 42 says, Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we've sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying the Lord is witness between you and me and between your descendants and my descendants forever." Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. And so David's left alone. And his last crutch, Jonathan, is now removed. God's going to use all of this to prepare David for when he's king. But at the time, and for the moment, David's overwhelmed with grief and with fear and with panic. He gets out of town. Some believe that it's during this season of David's life that he wrote Psalm 38, which says this: "All my longings lie before you, Lord. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pounds, my strength fails me. Even the light has gone from my eyes. My friends and companions avoid me because of my wounds. My neighbors stay far away. Those who want to kill me set their traps. Those who would harm me talk of my ruin. All day long they scheme and lie. I'm like the deaf who cannot hear, like the mute who cannot speak. I've become like one who does not hear, whose mouth can offer no reply. Lord, I wait for you. You will answer, Lord my God. For I said, do not let them gloat or exalt themselves over me when my feet slip. For I'm about to fall, and my pain is ever with me. I confess my iniquity. I'm troubled by my sin. Many have become my enemies without cause. Those who hate me without reason are numerous. Those who repay my good with evil lodge accusations against me, though I seek only to do what's good. Lord, do not forsake me. Do not be far from me, my God. Come quickly to help me, my Lord and my Savior." So what's he do? He goes to Nob. Nob's a town that's close to Jerusalem. David's hungry. He's destitute. And it's here in Nob that David forfeits his integrity. It says in chapter 21 and verse 1, David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on." What's David doing right here? It's called lying. There's no other way you can put any positive twist on this. He is lying. As for my men, what men? He doesn't have any men yet. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. Saul hadn't sent him on a mission. And so he forfeits his integrity here. He lies. And so Ahimelech offers him some of the consecrated bread, which they replace every few days. But he offers this consecrated bread to him as long as he and his men are clean. Well, David's imaginary men can be as clean as he wants them to be, right? So then David asks Ahimelech if he has any weapons. And he says this, "I don't have any weapons with me because, hey, when the king gave me the order, I had to get away fast. I didn't have time to get any weapons." And Ahimelech says, "Well, it just so happens that I do have a weapon here. I have Saul's sword. You're familiar with that, right?" Now, unfortunately, one of Saul's CIA agents, a man by the name of Doeg, who's from Edom, is witnessing all of this. And the priest giving aid to David, based upon David's lies. And so what does David do? Chapter 21 and verse 10 says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Now, what's going to happen to the priest when Doeg gives his report to Saul? Obviously, that's not even at the top of David's list of concerns, is it? Let's look at what does happen. Let's jump ahead. Now, I'm trying to get finished. I've got quite a bit still I need to get done today. Let's hope I do. But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and all the men of his family, who were the priest at Nob, and they all came to the king. Saul said, Listen now, son of Ahitub. Yes, my lord, he answered. Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lied in wait for me as he does today? Ahimelech answered the king, Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about the whole affair. But the king said, You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, who is an Edomite, so he doesn't care if they're priests or not. You turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg, the Edomite, turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, and its men and women, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. But one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. So this village is soaked with the blood of innocent people. Consequences of what? Saul's paranoid rage and David's lies. While David lost his integrity at Nob, oh man, he loses his dignity when he gets to Gath. You read that right, Gath. You remember Gath? Gath is the capital of the Philistines. But who's from Gath? Goliath. Okay, he's going to Goliath's hometown. And the servants of Achish, the king of Gath, recognized David. It says, Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one who they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And so what does David do? Well, obviously what any one of us would do if we were in his sandals, right? So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. David, this shepherd who is a man after God's own heart, mighty warrior, anointed one. What in the world has happened to you? And it's here that we believe he wrote another psalm, Psalm 56. It says, For the director of music to the tune of A Dove on Distant Oaks. Anyone know that one? That was an old George Strait hit. Of David, of Michtam, when the Philistines had seized him in Gath. He says, When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust and am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? In God, whose word I praise, and the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust and am not afraid. What can man do to me? I think David is trying to convince himself of this as he writes these words. He's obviously struggling at this point with his trust. In Psalm 34, interesting to me. Several psalms are like this, but in Hebrew, they are acrostic poems. They begin with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in order. Every verse begins with a sequential Hebrew letter of the alphabet. We don't get that in English. That would take a lot of work, wouldn't it? But he says this. It says, David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. So, even as he's writing these psalms, I think what he's doing is he's trying to convince himself of his need to trust in Yahweh. I hope that doesn't weaken this for you. It shouldn't. I mean, when we find ourselves in distress, these are the kind